Hello everyone. Simon Jacobson here. I welcome you all of you in the audience here, as well as cyberspace, which is potential 7 billion people, and counting. I was observing my grandchildren in my home the last few weeks, and I was observing them as I always do. Especially, I always observe children because they're like the pure form of us. And if you want to know where we have to go or align ourselves to be healthy, it's always good to look at the model, the so-called the pure prototype before it got messed up. So children are basically the purest version of us. And I was thinking, we live in a world where there's psychology is a big word. Everybody, some way, therapy, psychological stuff, trying to work out our issues, and whether it relates to issues like love and relationships, or things we're working through our childhoods, stuff like anger, management, guilt, fear, insecurity, the list goes on. Obviously, we're dealing with matters like abuse and dysfunctionality and addiction. I mean, I'm not going to list every possible scenario, but we live in a world that is very psychologically oriented, at least the Western world. And studying history, you don't really sense that it was always that way. Even though people were always human beings and they've always had issues, you clearly see it in the Bible itself and definitely through the ages. But the obsession of or maybe the availability of having so many types of healers on the psychological front was never quite as it is today. Now, you always had healers. There were witch doctors, there were prophets, there were sorcerers. There were all kinds of people dispensing, whether it's medications or advice or beliefs. That has always been part of the human condition. But I guess for some reason it feels far more, when we talk about things like the unconscious and the subconscious, it seems definitely more prevalent today. I should qualify this because, as I said, people always dealt with so-called invisible forces in their lives, and they would go to shamans, as I said, or witch doctors, or black magic, or white magic, or whatever it was called, to look for ways to protect their lives, to immunize themselves. I mean, the ancient Indians, Africans, and every culture had its healers. They were always very prominent. So in many ways there is certain similarity. I guess what I'm thinking is that today it is almost like a given that every person feels the need for addressing these type of issues. Now, in Torah and Judaism, you don't have a category called psychology, a subject called psychology. Now, you go to university, you have psychology, and you have other subjects, whether it's in the physical sciences or in the social sciences or in the political sciences. And there are actually some very professional medical people in the medical field that actually dismiss psychology. They almost dismiss it like they dismiss chiropractic. They see psychology as being some type of quack stuff. Many psychiatrists will tell you that about psychologists. I'm not here to weigh in on this. To me it comes down to, we don't live in a perfect world. Yes, there are many people who are scam artists, con artists, but many people that are really legitimate. There are people who are extremely excellent healers and excellent counselors who may not have a degree. You look in the Jewish perspective in history, what you find was in every community there are always wise men and women. And whether they had an official degree or not was not so relevant. They were trusted. They were people you went to talk to. Very similar to how we would go talk to our Babi or Zaidi type of thing. Grandmother or grandfather, if you had that experience. Some type of wisdom with years, people who've gone through a lot, who are beyond the dog eats dog mentality. They're not no longer in the ego, on the ego circuit. And you can get some wise counsel. You find the Torah says, ask your parent, your father, and he will tell you. Ask your grandparent. You find a lot less of this today, due to whatever the different reasons that people just don't communicate with their parents or grandparents. And but it's still fine. You'll find many people will remember their grandmother or grandfather, someone you could speak to very openly, will not judge you, or very direct. And but once upon a time, this was prevalent. Maybe because the Jewish environment, as the world in general, was much more insulated and in a way naive, closed. So you knew everybody. You knew who you were born and died in the same city. You knew everyone that was there. There was that Hamisha type of feel, and that creates a certain trusting environment. You found people to communicate and trust and so on. Today we live in a far more open society. Very little trust. Everybody is on the defense, knowing someone wants to sell them something, or want them to buy into something. So you don't find such trusting environment. So maybe the therapy business thrives because you're paying someone to trust, essentially. I'm not necessarily negating. That's maybe one of the responses to a world where you don't know whom to trust. So maybe you get a professional you can talk to. The reason I'm elaborating on all of this because every problem can be solved in two ways. You look at the situation, you try to find a remedy. But the healthiest approach to everything is best is preventive medicine, of course, as opposed to remedial medicine. Not to deal with the symptoms, but to deal with the roots and the causes. And to do that, you have to step back. So the reason I'm elaborating on this whole background, as I said, is to get to the root and to look at the broader picture. Because when you're in a situation, the Talmud says wisely, Ein chavish matir satzme, which means someone who's in fetters. Chavish means someone that's bound up, tied up, or in prison, cannot free himself. Matir would be cannot unloosen the knots. Because when you're in a pit, you can't pull yourself out of the pit. Physically and psychologically, emotionally, it's even bigger than that. Emotionally, when you're emotional, you're subjective about the situation, so you have blind spots. You may be part of the problem, right? You're trying to solve. You can't see yourself, you can't see your role in the whole situation. So, therefore, you need either objective advice or some way to step back and be able to look at the bigger picture. And that's how I look at the Judaism and Torah in general. Its greatest gift of all is context, perspective. When you speak to an older person who has experience, what you're really getting is perspective. You're getting someone who already climbed the mountain. They see the horizon more than someone who's just beginning to climb the mountain. That's what an expert is about. Someone who has more experience than you and I have. And each of us have our own expertise. But they give you context, and the context essentially really gives you the bigger picture. So, anyone would say, of course today, if you have fears and insecurities, you have issues with your parents or with your children or with your friends or with relationships, it would be good, wise to go get counsel, get advice from someone, especially someone that's trained. Let's assume you're getting the right advice, you're getting a good person. That makes sense. But the question really is this a remedy after the problem? In other words, it's like a type of symptomatic response? Or, if you had the right preventive medicine, if you had the right preventive measures in your life, maybe you wouldn't need to address it in the first place. So many ways you could say a healthy person, when they see, a really healthy person sees someone going to a psychologist or to a therapist, not that they'll dismiss it, people go, but it's like seeing someone who is not well going to a hospital or to a doctor. Now, nobody is a perfect human being. All of us can use always friends and support. The Mishnah says, you should appoint for yourself, designate for yourself a mentor, and acquire for yourself a friend. And this is across the board. The Mishnah does not say this only for people who have a problem or for people who have a particular issue. So it's a wise piece of advice for everybody, because everybody could use a mentor, could use a friend. But that means, because in the healthy situation, those two types of people will help you. Today, many of us go to find friends and to find mentors, not necessarily for the right reasons. It's because we have a problem. So we're trying to find the solution, so we're looking for someone to help us. Again, that per se doesn't mean a bad thing, but it's a big difference.
I think the outlet's not working. It's still going. I'm trying to switch it.
So the word psychology and the study of the human psyche can be really approached in two ways. One is because we have problems, so we go ahead and try to find out, like, what are the underlying factors. Let's say a clock isn't working, so you open it up to be able to see the pieces, the springs, the gears, and so on, the wheels, to check out what it's made of, what makes it tick, and why it's not ticking so well. And there's a whole different approach, which we'd call preventive, a healthy approach to life in general, that does so many things for you that are invisible, that just makes your clock work in the first place right. And now, you may say, what difference does it make? If I'm in trouble or I need help, I got to do what I have to do. Because even where we are today, this doesn't necessarily mean that we have to always approach everything in a remedial fashion. There are things you could begin doing today that will be preventive for tomorrow and the next days. It could be bad habits that we have and routines. And if someone points it out to you, you change your routine, and from here on, you stop toxifying your life, and you could actually start bringing in fresh air. So dealing with the topic called psychology in general is a double-edged sword in a sense, because when you speak about it, you often speak about it on terms that people relate to, which is usually a distorted view of it, because it's coming as a result of healing people who already have troubles, as opposed to the psychology of preventive medicine, which would really be a entire model that would teach us. Today we're having a lot of issues. Well, came right out. That's all right. I'll continue. So it would be a type of preventive psychology, let's put it that way, or a preventive approach to psychology. That's all right. Perfect. Got it. Which is why I go back to what I said about studying children. When you look at a child, and if you're able to study a child literally day to day, and see how parents or adults or the environment or other friends of the child all interact, and be able to study what are the effects that are causing a child to flourish, thrive, and what things are stunting or impeding a child's growth, there you'd have the best laboratory for really understanding psychology in the healthiest way. So use a simple example. You go to a garden and you see beautiful flowers growing. You go to another garden, you see the flowers have withered, or they never grown in the first place. It's overgrown with weeds. And you go back to the beginnings and you say both of these gardens were planted by the same gardener, the same seeds, So why did this one result in being overgrown with weeds and this one has beautiful flowers? The answer is very obvious. What care was taken? If you could study the history of this garden, you'll find out it was watered properly, it was weeded, someone looked after it, nurtured it, made sure on a daily basis everything is going right, didn't wait for trouble. And the other garden was neglected. Either it wasn't watered, or weeds were allowed to grow, or somebody was neglectful and just didn't come around for a few weeks or a few months or a few years. Absenteeism. Very obvious. No one would argue about this point. There's always mysterious factors, I'm sure. But first you have to eliminate the usual suspects before you get to the mysterious factors. So the same thing is with us. We are born, we're seeds as well, planted into our mother's womb. The seed is fertilized, and the conception of a child begins, develops for 9 months, approximately, in its mother's womb. And then we emerge. And from there, they say everything is downhill. Hopefully not. But now this child is no longer protected within the mother's womb, provided for, nurtured, watered, fed, and everything that goes on, the mysteries of the womb. Despite even the mother's functionality, even a dysfunctional mother cannot help but nurture her child in her mother's womb, because there's just biological factors that, obviously, God forbid, any parent, any mother can become a drug addict or alcoholic, and that can affect the child. But I'm talking about, barring any particular deliberate or specific type of deprivation of a child, there is a natural process of protection and nurturing and nourishment, etc. But then the child now, once the umbilical cord is cut, the child is now no longer, it's still completely dependent on its environment and parents, but now it needs to be fed and needs to be cared for. Now there's no longer just an automatic nurturing process. Now you need a gardener that's going to be conscientious and sensitive and care. Now you could say healthy parents will care and will do all that's necessary. Okay, great. Problem is, not all parents are healthy. Now, you could always go back to the root of that and say, okay, those parents aren't healthy because their parents weren't so healthy. We as Jews believe, when you go back to the Bible, that as you go earlier back, parents were very healthy. Adam and Eve were created by God. So they did not have any dysfunctional parents. They had no excuse like that. So some human error had to come into play for this to begin to spiral out of control. But not all is lost, because even dysfunctional parents do have measures of love, and more importantly, we can correct the process. Even a garden that is overgrown and the flowers seem to be withering doesn't mean it's not salvageable. In our case, it's absolutely salvageable. Some gardens aren't salvageable. You have to start from scratch. But with a human being, we have a resilient soul. And because we have a resilient soul, we're able to access or revisit the healthy elements that have not been neglected and allow them to reinvigorate the rest of us. So you can replant the garden. You can begin to nurture it. But obviously first step one is to identify this and begin to do something about it. So when you look at a healthy upbringing, a healthy situation, health, interestingly, is very silent. What's loud is lack of health. The aberration and the anomaly is when things are not healthy. Just to give you an example, if someone asks you, what does it feel like to be healthy? If you can describe the sensation, it's not a good sign usually. Because like someone says, what does it feel like to breathe? It shouldn't feel like anything. It should feel like you just breathe. You don't even have to open your mouth to breathe. There's a natural process. There shouldn't be any sounds. There shouldn't be any impediments. It's just a flow. What does it feel like that your blood is flowing through your veins? You shouldn't be feeling anything. You shouldn't be hearing gurgling. You shouldn't be hearing sounds or thuds. So health is actually a non-feeling. It's that everything is just so smooth and seamless that you don't feel anything. And when you do feel something, it means there's some impediment. There's something getting in the way. When you run fast, you hear your heartbeat because it's not natural. It's compensating. I mean, it's necessary to compensate because you need more energy, but it's not in the natural flow of things. You look at a newborn child or a young child, you see its chest heaves up and down, perfect symmetry, because the lungs take in all the air, and not because the child is just small, it breathes in a healthy way. By the time we're whatever age we are, we're not breathing completely with our complete lungs. That's why when most of us take a full breath in, usually we'll cough, because we don't breathe all the way in and out, because a part of our lungs is now basically been written off, has been toxified. There's toxins inside of us. And then the food and the air and everything, the environments. So on a psychological level, this is far more complicated, because in psychology, you see, a lung, you can train yourself, you can exercise, you can begin to use your lungs. It's much more physical, tangible. If you feel a pain, you do something about it. But the psychological health, called the psyche, the spiritual, emotional, and psychological health of a human being, is far more elusive. Because how do you measure it? But there's ways to measure it, and that's what we're discussing. But I wanted to just, as an introduction, just demonstrate how the healthiest human beings are people who you can't really gauge, because it doesn't sound or feel like anything. You can't measure health. You can only measure illness. And by that, and by contrast, you can measure what health is. I mean, even purely on a very basic level, when an infection, God forbid, is identified in the body, the infection is not identified. It's the antibodies that are identified, that gather to fight the infection. The white blood cells come to protect the body. That's how you know there's a problem there. So, basically, health is almost unmeasurable. If you wanted to know what a healthy person is like, you'd have to study someone who just grew. It's like saying, what makes a flower a flower? Well, it's working well. It's far easier to identify the culprits that cause the problems. But our goal is to achieve a type of health which is initially healthy, and that prevents many of the issues that cause us to have anxiety and fear and insecurity and so on and so forth. So yes, it would have been the best possible scenario where each of us as young children were under the protection and care of perfect gardeners, meaning our parents, who took care of the flowers perfectly and let them grow and made sure that there weren't other influences, and let us nurture us to build our confidence and security in ourselves to take on any challenge in life. It's absolutely doable if done right. Unfortunately, it's rare, because number one, parents are not that healthy. Number two, they're busy. Maybe it's interdependent. And as a result, the flowers are not allowed to completely be nurtured properly. So then we have no choice but to resort to remedial solutions and interventions. I say all this as a type of introduction to something I spoke about last week that I want to elaborate further on, and that is that last Saturday night was the 200th yahrzeit of a great man. His name was the Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi. That's how he was known. Those days they didn't yet have surnames, but because he was Shneur Zalman, his children began to be known as Shneur's sons of Shneur, Shneuri. And he was a student of the great Maggid of Mezrich, who in turn was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. As Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, in Hasidic lore, in Hasidic literature, it discusses him as a unique soul, as being those rare souls that never came down to earth before. Most souls are seen as reincarnations. That doesn't make them less important. It means that every one of us has an absolute indispensable mission to fulfill. But then there are times in history where a new soul enters. It's called a neshama chadash. A new soul is sent when there's a new mission, like a new era is to begin. Moshe Rabbeinu is a classic example. A new era began. Whenever there's a new era, this requires a whole new type of pioneer. Think of it like a pioneering soul. And this man went on to pioneer, what I would say, being someone who's a student of this school of thought called Chabad Chassidus, pioneered literally, I would coin it as a revolutionary new approach to psychology and philosophy, and in general to how we look at the world and ourselves. I know it's a strong statement, and most of you probably went to school and learned about all kinds of different thinkers and philosophers that have shaped our perspective on ourselves and others. I don't know how many of you have so-called your heroes that you identify as those people who've shaped your perspective on life. Sometimes we don't even want to say who our real heroes are because the perspectives aren't that great. But there were definitely throughout history many thinkers. Well, he goes up there to the top, but unfortunately most of what he taught remains pretty much a best kept secret because it's written in Hebrew, and even more problematic is that it is cryptic, and you need to know how to decipher it. So it's not just read Hebrew and then you just. But literally in any area of how we look at life, this man had pioneering ideas to share. Now the interesting thing is they're not new in the sense he innovated them. They're based on thousands of years of Jewish scholarship and Jewish wisdom and experience, which is plenty. I did a little research in the last 30 years, last 10 administrations in the United States have at least 10 Jews on their cabinet or as advisors. It's pretty interesting. No Jew has been a president yet, but every president has had around 10 Jewish advisors, a million. Why? It's a very disproportionate amount of advisors based on the Jewish population, just like 40% of Nobel Prizes go to Jews. The answer is because on a very basic level, Jews have the wisdom and experience, even on a very historical level, a certain accumulative wisdom and experience that lends itself to be very valuable when you're dealing on a governmental level, global issues, and other nations or other types of advice and wisdom that Jews are able to provide. So the Alter Rebbe's wisdom and scholarship came as a scholar from thousands of years of this scholarship and wisdom and experience. But yet he developed it into, when I say a new psychology, into something that would address a new generation, a new era. Because he lived, as I said, 200 years ago he passed away, which means 1812. 1812 is the time of the Russian-French War. Many attribute that period, but not many, everybody does, to the beginning of the modern era. The Industrial Revolution is usually identified as 1840, just for a little context. Industrial Revolution was preceded by the Enlightenment for the Jews, the emancipation of the Jews, which followed the Renaissance. So that whole period where we were transitioning from the Middle Ages into what we call the modern age, which is symbolized by some key benchmarks of this period are really what shape our lives today. The scientific revolution. Religion stopped having that type of monopoly, total authority and control. Monarchs fell. Democracy and freedom began to be recognized. Freedom of rights. The United States is essentially a little more than 200 years old. 1776 is that period when the Alter Rebbe lived. So you're talking about major shifts were taking place in the Western world primarily. And it's very obvious that those shifts have shaped the world as we know. The 18th and 19th century shaped the 20th and 21st century. Because those were the beginnings that would ultimately lead to what is accelerated into a technological revolution and to an information age. And everything else we're experiencing today, and far more accelerated than it was back in the 19th century. And of course the challenges that began to be posed: how do you balance faith and modernity? How do you balance free inquiry and absolute values? Religion and faith and reason, beliefs and reason. Religion and freedom of expression, etc., etc. And these are issues that absolutely continue to affect us. We continue to debate them. We also still deal with the challenges of fundamentalism versus a more tamed approach to faith and religion. So the list goes on. And literally in all these areas, the Alter Rebbe addressed it very directly and very powerfully. So I wanted to focus primarily on the psychological dimension. Last week I spoke more in broader terms, both the psychological and the philosophical. I'm going to talk more of the psychological. But the reason I gave the long introduction was because it's very difficult to address without first defining psychology in a preventive context and in a remedial context. Because they're very different. Even though they may still address the same human psyche, but it's a lot different when you need to teach how to garden, how to nurture a healthy flower than how to revive a withered one. Very, very different approach. It still needs watering, and it still needs the nurturing in the withered situation. But the whole entire approach and the assumptions are very, very different, because you're dealing now with a broken, something broken that needs to be fixed. And the Alter Rebbe addresses this as well. His obvious goal, which is the ultimate goal, and the far shorter approach, shorter road, is what we call the long short road as opposed to the short long road, as he alludes to. The story goes in the Talmud that as a guy was traveling toward a city and came to a crossroad. He wants to know how to get to the city he's getting to, let's say Jerusalem. So Yogi Berra would say, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. And the Talmud tells the story. So the traveler, comes to the fork in the road, and he asks one of the little Jerusalem children, who are known to be very wise, and said, so what's the shortest path, what's the shortest road to, fastest way to Jerusalem? The child cryptically says, this is the long short road, and this is the short long road. And he scampers away. Now this fellow, short long, sounded to him shorter than long short, because I guess short came first. So he takes this short long road, and yes, he sees the city right up ahead, not far. Problem is, between him and the city, the road is completely overgrown with thorns and bushes and this. He spends all day, gets himself all scratched up, and never makes it. So he comes back to the fork in the road, sees the child again, and says, you told me this was the short long road. He says, yes, short but long. And this is the long but short road. So he took the long road, and this was a far longer way to go, to travel more miles, kilometers, but there was nothing blocking the path. It was a clear path. Now we always choose the short long road because we live in an instant gratification, fast food age. So we want quick results, fast. Press a button, here's the result. But you often get a short long road. You're by the button, but since it's not integrated and it's not personalized and you haven't matured into internalizing it into your life, it's not integrated, as I said. Whereas the long short road may take a longer time, but when you get there, you own it. It's yours. And it's internal, and it's maintainable, it's sustainable. So the same thing is when you're dealing with issues like this, there is the long short road is the one that I wish everybody would employ, which is how we bring up our children in the first place. Who is it that said? Frederick Douglass said. He's one of the ex-slaves that wrote about slavery and emancipation of the black slaves in America. So he said it's infinitely easier to bring up a healthy child than to fix a broken adult. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, absolutely. Because to fix something that's broken adult requires far more time, energy, aggravation, money, everything. We bring up a healthy child in the first place, yes, it requires patience and time and so on. But once it's in its right place, I can't even know how to measure the difference in economically, forget about economically, it's just simply in man hours. So in this approach to a psychological health, it's critical that even if we're not perfect flowers, to understand what a perfect flower is like. So for example, when you have a teacher who teaches us music or art, even if we're beginners and we can't yet create anything beautiful, you still are shown, even a beginner is shown what the great masters produced. Or listen to this beautiful music from the great classical composers. Now why would you show a beginner the greatest out there? Because you want to give them context, you want to give them a backdrop. If you don't know what a perfect circle is like, you have nothing to compare, you have nothing to juxtapose. Where do you stand? You could delude yourself into thinking, I'm just a few, just a few steps away. It's important to see what the best have done. It gives you a standard to grow toward. And therefore, even no matter who you are, it is important to know what does health look like, even if you're not a healthy person. Because then you know what you're looking for. You're looking what to align yourself to. Because you don't want to create, as some wise people have said, a philosophy out of your flaws. Everybody has flaws. But you don't want to make a philosophy out of them and say, oh, these aren't flaws, it's part of life, it's a reality. Because then it becomes generational, where you made a whole philosophy out of it. Now go fix something that you think is a legitimate philosophy. So it's important to know that if a person is, let's say, breathing, God forbid, difficultly, that is not normal, and that's not healthy. Not to say, I'll just live with it. Obviously, there's situations we have to live with because we have no choice. But to turn something unhealthy and to call it health because it makes you more comfortable, or because then you don't have to do anything about it, is even more destructive. So it's important to call a spade, which is why they say in the healing world that silence is worse than the rape. Because to be violated and to have have a crime perpetrated is terrible. But to be invalidated, to say that didn't even happen, and you're silent, you can't even cry, and you have no right to express yourself, is far greater crime. Because then you don't even let the healing process begin. Now obviously we all wish there was no first crime in the first place. But in some way the cover-up is far deeper, because it's like someone, you cut yourself, and someone says, you didn't cut yourself, it's an illusion. So you don't even go ahead and try to heal it. You start living with the reality, hey, you know what, pain is normal. And it shouldn't be that way. So Yediyas Hamach L'Chetzer Refuah, the knowledge, the awareness of a problem is half the cure. So in this context, I want to review a few key elements of the Alter Rebbe's psychology, which, as I said, is primarily meant to be preventive, but obviously also can address anyone in any situation. But it paints a picture. What is a human being capable of? What do you look like in your purest form? It's critical in the healing process. Because imagine you went to a therapist, and she or he said to you, what, before we begin, we're going to map out what you really look like before all the distortions settled in. Now you may not believe it, but let's say a person could actually map it out. Then you have a whole different approach. Then it's a question of, how do I get there now? But if you have no clue what your purest form looks like, then where are you growing toward? You're here, and now where am I going? You're going this way, that way, this way. That's why I said you want to have a pure version of what we're like. Or essentially, what does your map look like when you were a child, before a freshly fallen snow, before someone trampled on it? So the Alter Rebbe, using the models and using the map of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, both beginning from the Zohar and the words and the writings of the Arizal, the great Kabbalist of the 16th century, maps out what a human being really looks like in its purest form. The word used for it is actually a biblical expression. It says in the beginning of the Bible, it says that God created the human being, B'Tselem Elokim, the divine image. That's the first description of a human being in the Torah, the Bible. B'Tselem Elokim. God says, I want to create someone, Salmenu Kid Musenu. B'Tselem Admus, in the image and in the form of the divine. Now that alone requires volumes to understand just that one expression. Because elsewhere we know, and logic dictates, that God doesn't have a shape and form. Like it says, God doesn't have not a body and not the image of a body. Image denotes a structure. Structure denotes definition, and definition is the antithesis to something that's divine, which is beyond definition. Definition is a defined structure. But yet, without elaborating, Telf is also, Rabbi Shneur Zalman in more philosophical terms explains this concept as well, but I'll just sum it up by saying that the divine chose to manifest in a structure. Not that the divine is fundamentally structured, but the divine manifests in a structure in order to give us, human beings, a pure structure by which to align ourselves toward. So you have your Tselem Elokim. That would be, I would say, the perfect picture of what you should look like. So you ever see these X-rays of, let's say, lungs, or X-rays of the heart, or CAT scans. So you'll see them like put them up on black negatives, right? Put them up on a lit up screen, so you can see, and they look at it, and someone with a trained eye can see their growth, a blockage, God forbid, etc., etc. They want to show you, a layperson, what it looks like. Well, they always put a healthy lung near an unhealthy one, so you can see, here's what a healthy lung looks like, and right here, put another one, juxtapose, and you see right away, hey, what's this doing here? So right there you have, what would your Tzelem Elokim look like on this screen? Would be a perfect X-ray of your soul, untouched by anything, no distortions. Wouldn't that be cool, to be able to see that image of yourself? It would make many of us cry, because then you start looking at the other X-ray and say, 1 second, that's pretty far away. How do I wander from here to here? Sometimes you could look at it even in a simple way. I remember a few years ago, right before Rosh Hashanah, someone emailed me a picture of themselves as a little girl, and she writes to me just one little email. I was so taken by it. She writes to me, where did this little child go? So it's her 35 years ago, and it's not even an X-ray. We're just talking about the face, child's face, and then everything you've gone through. So you may not always see every wrinkle and every crevice of your face, but nevertheless, the body carries the memories. So we all have, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman in the most very meticulous way, through Hasidic texts in general, maps out this Tzelem Elokim. So, of course, it gives me the idea, that's what we should create. We should create some type of spiritual lab where you can get a picture of what your Tzelem Elokim looks like. And it's not that difficult. It requires studying, obviously, your life now, and tracing it backwards, following the blueprint that he lays out. You can more or less get yourself somewhat of a picture. It won't be a negative, because you can't take a picture of the divine spirit within you. The soul doesn't photograph well, or at all for that matter. But you can get a description of it. What does it look like? What does pure chesed look like? What does pure gevura look like? Which I'll address in a moment. So number one is, as a good soul doctor, as a master soul doctor, the Alter Rebbe lays out this map. What does the soul look like? Now, of course, there are similarities, just like bodies are similar. Lungs look similar in an X-ray. But nevertheless, each of us have our own unique lungs. So we also have our own unique souls. And he lays out this map, which, just to give you a little taste of it, I captured part of it in the book on the Omer that I did, the 49 steps, 7 times 7. Essentially, the 7 emotions are 7 times 7, 49 components of this X-ray, of this divine image, the emotional aspects of it. So it breaks down basically, as the Alter Rebbe writes, into 10 conscious faculties. And then there's the unconscious. We'll deal with the conscious right now. The 10 conscious faculties divide into 3 cognitive ones and 7 emotional ones. So Chachma is number 1. It's how we conceive of things. Everything begins with some type of, I conceived of something. I thought of something. That conceiving is step 1, which is really, there's a pure form of Chachma. If you juxtapose how your Chachma is today to the way it is in the pure, let's call it the pure X-ray, the healthiest form, you could say, okay, this is pure Chachma, and where does my Chachma stand? This is something that can be very quantified and really understand how far are you. Then there's Bina, and then there's Das. I'm not going to go through all of the details. And then comes 7 emotional ones. Love. What does healthy love look like? I know many people will say, 1 second, what does that mean? Is there one way that healthy love looks? No, there's not one way, because obviously each of us is a different person, but there are elements what makes a love healthy, and there are elements that make love unhealthy. And there are common descriptions. No, a love, for example, that hurts somebody, something's wrong with it. Doesn't mean it's not love, but it's a distorted form of it. A love that doesn't know how to be harnessed and just gives and doesn't know when to stop, you also know can be love, but it's out of control. A love that's there but does not express itself. I mean, I can go on and on that you could have love and it could be very distorted. And the same thing then is all the other emotions, whether it's, if love is giving, gvura is like discipline, withholding. If love is attraction, gvura is like repulsion, to be repelled. And then you have compassion, and then you have the other emotions. So the Alter Rebbe, in a very detailed way, gives us a picture of what a healthy psyche looks like. And then he starts discussing how it travels, how it gets from healthy to not so healthy. And primarily it begins with concealment. That's a key word that he uses, concealment. Things get covered up. As they covered up, that doesn't necessarily mean they become unhealthy, but as they get covered up, you start losing sight of them. And that's the first problem. Because when you lose sight, you don't know what to, you lose direction. So it's like, imagine you're riding on a dark road, and suddenly the lights go out. It's the first problem. If you don't have the lights, you don't know which way to go. So he describes a thing called that there are the faculties of the soul, and then there's what we call levushim, garments. So a human body is born without clothing, naked. We dress ourselves in clothing for one reason, or to protect ourselves, whether it's from the weather, or whether it's from other people, or whether it's from the elements. Clothing is a concealer, not a revealer. The human body itself is who you are. It also conceals your soul, but it's still your raw, your naked skeleton, so to speak. So garments per se are not a bad thing. They protect us. If it's cold outside, you need to put on heavier clothing. When you're among other people, you need to protect yourself as well. And I don't just mean from a sexual context, just in general. There's a certain dignity, right, about being covered up. There's a certain dignity about being not exposed, your whole vulnerability, and so on and so forth. So garments are, in the broader sense, not just garments, physical garments, they're also how we speak. We don't just tell everybody what we feel. We wear different masks. We wear different garments as we express ourselves. People you trust more, you have less veils. People you trust less, there are more veils. We even learn to be duplicitous. You can put on a mask that completely doesn't reflect who you are at all. You could show someone a smile and you really hate them. You could show someone a smirk and doesn't mean that necessarily that's really what you feel. So these particular so-called veils, per se, if they're under your control, are not necessarily bad things. But after a while, when there's too many veils, let's put it, too many defense mechanisms start coming into play, what happens is it conceals too well. And you start losing sight of what you are in your purest form. So when some of us, for example, have difficulty giving love, it could be because when we gave, we were hurt. So we taught ourselves to stop giving so quickly. To the point that you may no longer be your natural self. You'd want to give, but now you've put on these brakes and you've assumed a new personality that you may even know is not you. Or you may come to a point you don't even know it's not you because it's become so part of you, you forgot what you were really like. So this goes on. You can go through a whole life and start seeing, okay, so what remains from what was in the original picture and what do you have right now? And you can actually juxtapose the healthy lungs over the unhealthy ones. Or in this case, the healthy psyche or the healthy love over the not so healthy. Now, it's not extremes. We're not talking here 100% perfect and then you're 100% not perfect. It's usually some measure. You could still see its lungs, but you see there's also other things in the way. And this can become the basis of literally a diagnosis, a spiritual diagnosis of a human being's life. Here's your pure Tzelem Elokim, divine image, here's what happened, and here's where you are today. Now obviously we have to work our way backwards, we have to work what do we have, but someone who understands and knows this perfect picture can help very much identify and say, okay, here's the perfect picture, here's where you are, now let's figure out how did this get here? What happened? We may not even remember, it may not even be a memory, it may be accumulation of many factors through life. Like I said, a garden doesn't just suddenly go out of control. What happens is, slowly, this is deprived, that's deprived, all kinds of things happen. And we compensate, and we complement, and we adjust, etc., etc. You ever see roots search for water? They'll grow all kinds of grotesque manners just to find water. If there's something in the way, they'll have to grow around it. Same thing is with our flowers. If there were blocks, we're going to do something naturally or not naturally that will try to get us the nourishment we need. And this can literally become a true, I would say, spiritual roadmap, a spiritual X-ray that juxtaposed with the Tselem Elokim, the way you're meant to be, or the way you really are in your purest form, is a real way of finding solutions. Because then the question is, okay, if I see this is what the pure picture looks like, here's what's not so pure, you start isolating, divide and conquer. You don't try to solve everything at once and say, let's figure out, here's one piece of the puzzle. What would be required to unblock something so the healthy divine image could reemerge? Everyone following so far? Okay. Now, there are a few other factors that are part of this psychological so-called blueprint of the Alter Rebbe's. The next one is, what type of power do we have? Because all this can be nice and good, beautiful stated. You have an image, a perfect image, things happen, now you have a distorted image. In whatever fashion or form it takes. Now, who says, someone can make the argument, that you can just go back? Maybe I'm damaged goods, it's too late. Like I said before with the garden. Once you haven't watered a flower long enough, you can't just suddenly start pouring water on it and it's going to regrow back. It's not going to necessarily, it may have been damaged in the root. So here come a few key other principles that Rabbi Shneur Zalman, Alter Rebbe, establishes. Number one is, it's true with a flower, that may be the case. There comes a point, there are flowers that can be revived. We see this. Sometimes, professionals can look and say, this shrub, even though it's dried out, but there's still a sign of life, and if I do the right thing, I can revive it. But there are times that you can't. So the number one thing that he establishes, actually two things I would say. One thing is that there's always something remains alive when it comes to the soul. Because you see, a divine image cannot be destroyed by anybody, even by the most abusive environment. It could be sent into hiding. It can be concealed. It can be really deeply concealed. It can be veiled to the point that no one can see it. But it's never dead. So with a flower, you can't make that statement that's never dead. You may need to bring new seeds in. So that's number one. And there's a long case how he makes this also based on mystical and biblical texts, including the Talmud. The Alter Rebbe develops a whole approach of what the soul's ability to never become extinguished. Soul always remains intact. Question is, what level of the soul? Yes, the outer levels may be concealed, but there's no such thing as damaged goods. You can have damaged exteriors, you can have damaged channels, but you cannot have a damaged soul. At its core, it always remains intact. But that still doesn't mean it's easy to bring it back to life in the other levels, so we'll get to that in a moment. Another important thing is, I don't know if you've ever gone to these tours through a forest that went through a fire. Almost every forest has gone through some fire. So people who are trained can show you the parts of a forest that regenerated after a fire. They look different. And it's interesting, the regeneration process in some ways is far richer than the original forest, which is why they deliberately often light forest fires, because it's actually a way of reviving nutrients and letting the forest grow much healthier. Obviously it has to be controlled in a certain setting, and we would think a fire is destructive. Not necessarily, because there's a certain power in nature that has the power to regenerate. And even severe fires, God forbid, affecting human beings, but affecting nature has a power to create a revival that is often, as I said, more powerful than it was in the first place. Because there's something in nature, in the actual earth, that never disappears, like I just said. It's revived. It may not be the actual same seeds, but something in the earth that allows it to regenerate. You see this again and again. I don't know if you ever see these places, it's fascinating. You see tree stumps, you see trees that burn down. You don't see the burn anymore, but you can see where they were. And then you see what grew up above them. And what grew above them is unbelievably rich. Where did it come from? Thought everything was burned. Now obviously burnt to the parched ground to the point of parched earth can become to the point that you can't revive. But I just wanted to use it as an example. You see this in many, many instances in nature. I mean, when we call natural disasters is when humans collide with nature. But nature itself has a way of degenerating, and never worry about nature. It'll take care of itself. It's humans that we have to worry about. Nature has a way. Storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. The tragedy is when humans are in the path, then there's destruction. But in natural order, if you study some science, but in meteorology, you'll know that hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes are very necessary for the balance of this earth. You eliminate those forces, this earth would not be here. Some of them are like natural vacuum cleaners. Some of them are natural tension releasers. Like an earthquake is essentially releasing tensions between plates. Now the tragedy becomes if there's a city on top of the fault line, but not per se. Earthquakes are happening under the ocean almost all the time, as are volcanoes, and so on. So the bottom line is there's a certain process in nature that is very, very reminds us and a very good teacher of what it means to grow and regenerate. But let me go back now to how do you get? So I'm here, and how do I get back there? So we can't turn the clock back. We're not talking about going back in time and going back to your childhood. We are talking about, however, going back to your Tzelem Elokim, to the image in which you were created. So everybody knows the story of Daniel in the den of lions, right? In the lion's den. The lion's den is an expression, comes from the Bible. That Daniel was thrown into a lion's den, and instead of them killing him and eating him, they just respected him, and they just were sitting there in awe. And Daniel just made it right through, and everybody realized. Now, everyone thinks this is a miracle. And actually, the Torah explains it this way. In the beginning of the Bible, it says, because the human being was created in the divine image, that's why every creature on earth will fear the human being and will not attack a human being. Fear necessarily because the human will kill the animal. We're not talking about that. Just a natural fear of humans. That's what it says in the Torah. And you see it with many creatures. Again, I'm not talking about once we've gotten rifles and weapons. Even left our own accord, where animals are far stronger than we are, there's that respect. So of course the obvious question everyone asks is, so why do we see animals attacking humans? And that has happened more than once, unfortunately. So the answer given, which may surprise you, is because the animal does not see the divine image on this person's face. And once it's concealed, the animal looks at a human, doesn't see a human, sees an animal. So in other words, it's all about what you're projecting. Daniel in the lion's den had his divine image intact, so it was not an issue. It wasn't even a miracle. The lion just naturally respected that. They saw something. Now, you say, okay, well, if that's the case, then if children would be put in the path of animals, they should be, because children definitely have not done anything yet. It's a good question. And as a matter of fact, it says in the prophet that when Mashiach comes, a child will lie with a lion. A child will lead a lion, and the lion will not attack the child. But we see evidence to the contrary. We see animals, bears, and others have attacked children, unfortunately, sadly. So, this is my thought. I haven't seen this anyway, but it's based on what it says in the time of the flood. It says the great flood was because the world was corrupt. God said we have to cleanse the earth and begin anew. So Noah and his family took animals into the ark with them, of all the species, and that's how the world was rebuilt. Like a regeneration process, as I mentioned. The question is, why were the animals killed? It's the humans that were corrupt. Why did God take it out on the animals? So I found my answers just last year, actually here in Manhattan, of all places. I found an answer to a biblical question of several thousand years. Someone who I know told me that his dog began acting up, She took the dog to a dog therapist. There is such a thing. There are veterinarians. There are even dog retirement villages, I hear. I guess I don't know who's retiring, but so they took the dog to a therapist, and the therapist told them that the dog is developing a lot of anxiety because clearly it's an environment that's very anxious because this guy and his wife are always fighting. So the battles between the spouses creating this neurosis that the dog is now becoming neurotic. So I got my answer. That's the answer. The animals began all right. There was no problem. The problem is the corruption of the human beings corrupted the animals as well. That was the picture. So I'm thinking that maybe that's why, God forbid, an animal may attack even a child, because the purest child is still, unfortunately, under the influence of this world, and in some way the divine image in all of us has been compromised. Anyway, just a theory and a thought. You can take it or leave it. But going back to our discussion here, I have no doubt. You ever go into a room, to a party, you come to a party, you can right away feel as soon as you walk in the vibe ain't good. You just feel it. You feel it's like tense. And usually the reason is because it's from the top. The hosts are usually not in the best disposition, or something's going on and it spills over and everybody's like tense. And then you come into places where just a certain natural warmth, natural, you feel comfortable. And again, you can attribute it straight to the top. These things are not tangible, but you sense it. You can sometimes look at a face. I remember when we were children, there were certain people, which I don't want to mention names, we hated them. They were like these old men, they looked angry, and children always ran away from them. Especially when they came to pinch you, like they thought in a cute way, but you hated them touching you. And then there were people that you just were drawn to. Just sweet. Now children have an instinct. Obviously people can manipulate, and I'm talking about healthy adults, hopefully. But there is a vibe we all give off. There's an expression, Chachmas Adam Teir Panav. The wisdom of a person radiates on the face. And you can see it. There are times where there's a certain contentment, a certain inner peace that comes through on the face. Interesting thing is, in Hebrew, the word for face, panim, is the same word for insides, pnimius, pinim. Now you think of face, when you say the face of the object, usually means the external, the face, the outer face, the surface. In Hebrew, the face means the inner, because the true face is a seamless reflection of your insides. What you see is what you get. As I said before, we've developed veils and ways that our face does not reflect our insides. But when you see somebody who radiates, truly radiates, it's a reflection of, like they say, the eyes are the window to the soul. The face is an expression of an inner energy. And you can also see in the face sometimes the opposite. And I don't mean when someone's scowling or you see anger. I'm talking about you see a regular face. There's a certain energy that comes. There's a glow, a shine, an aura. In all these words you can use. You see it time and again in different situations. So, going back to this, we all have a Tzelem Elokim, but it needs to be nurtured. It needs to be fed. So there's a story in the Talmud that says Rabbi Yehuda came into a city, and he walked in, his face was glowing. So the townspeople, who were simple people, began to speculate among themselves, why is he glowing? And one said he must have eaten a very good piece of pork. So so he's really satisfied. A good piece of flesh. Meat. Another one said he must have lent somebody money on high interest. He made a lot, Another person said, well, he must have done something which, of course, they projected, but they would bring them glow. Okay? Now, everybody was projecting. Everybody was thinking, what would make my face glow? And they were thinking, Rabbi Yehuda. So they went over to him and asked him, okay, so why is your face glowing? So his answer was, because I found a new manuscript. He was a scholar. He was a teacher. What made his face glow was knowledge. He found a new piece of knowledge. Now they couldn't relate to that because knowledge didn't make their faces glow. They had other things to make faces glow. This is the example of what will make you glow. As a human being, what makes you shine? So we all know we have instant gratification methods to do that. Some people drink a good espresso and they just glow for a few minutes until the after effects. Some people glow in different fashions. But we're talking here not something that is superficial or momentary or like, a jolt that just makes you feel good for the moment. What makes a person glow from a Torah point of view is when your tzelem elikim, which may be laying dormant and asleep for a long time, is brought alive again. Your insides are coming out. There's nothing more glowing than when your insides resonate with the truth. You hear something, you say, wow, that's true. I heard that somewhere, or it relates to me, that's me. Or you hear a song and it resonates. That's where you see a real glow. What's happening? What's happening is that the real you that has been so concealed for so long has been touched, has been aroused, has been tickled, if you wish. Sometimes humor does it. In a different way you can put it is when you feel that you belong. Sometimes most of us don't feel we belong in a place. I'm here, I have to be here, I'm here. I adjust. Some people know how to adjust well. But then you're sometimes in an environment, it could be in front of beautiful nature. You see a beautiful sunset. You're floating on the water. You're in some other environment and you just feel, I feel one with this place. I feel seamless. I feel melting into the place. I feel like this is exactly where I should be now and here. These are things that make a person glow because it brings you back to that child, to the pure divine image, which has exactly that feeling. It's seamless and it knows that it has to be here, and it's just health that doesn't feel like anything. Just the way it is. You see, why do children attract us so much? You look at a child, there's like that irresistible thing with a child. You want to hug the child, you want to kiss the child, you want to touch his cheek, whatever it is. Well, I hope that's how we feel. What is this? What is it? Because you see purity. You see the glow. You see someone who has not been jaded. Now, we don't have to use words necessarily. Everything has to become scientific, but I'm trying to express the inexpressible. To say the words, because we need words, because we're not there. If you're there, you don't need to explain it. If someone who hears a beautiful piece of music doesn't have to explain to someone, hey, listen, I'll give you the whole scientific analysis why music touches me. Just listen to the music. Two people listen together. And you see this. You see when people dance. When there's harmony. In song or in dance. What's harmony? Harmony is exactly the same thing. It's a resonance of a type of inner reality that everything is aligned. And when you feel it, you just go with the flow. Most of our lives are not in such harmony. Because we don't have that Tzelem Elikim just accessible. So, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, Rabbi Alter Rebbe, in his most eloquent fashion, both maps out what it looks like, tells us and teaches us that you have access to it all the time. The challenge is to find the right tools to access it, and then, above all, to make it part of your reality. One more point he makes in this context, and this I think I did mention last week, is that you also have the ability to overcome any challenge. Because someone can say, okay, everything you said till now, all fine and good. But I'm so far from there. I've developed bad habits, I'm depressed, I feel it's hopeless, I've given up, I'm resigned, etc. What am I supposed to do now? So he makes it very clear that you have the power to get yourself out of your funk or whatever it may be. And you have what he calls, as I discussed last week in chapter 12 of Tanya, natural self-control. A human being has the ability to overcome emotional debilitation or demoralization and to actually rise to a greater place. And this is not a control that one acquires through education or through skills. You're born with this. It's a natural power in a human being is just to be able to transcend your circumstances. And this is a critical piece because in psychology, especially modern psychology, much of it is based on certain fatalism almost. A certain predestined or you are wired a certain way, you can't change it. You're basically a beast or you're a selfish gene in the words of Richard Dawkins. And you can't change much. What you can do is harness a bit, direct, guide, control a bit, like red light, green light. Yeah, you can impose upon yourself, and using Freudian words, the id is the uncontrollable animal, selfish beast, And then there is the ego and the superego that you can impose upon yourself. You know what? I need to coexist. I can't just satisfy my every selfish indulgence. I need to give a little and so on. But at heart, push comes to shove, we're very selfish creatures. Alter Rebbe completely disagrees with that. Not that we can't be selfish. We definitely have a selfish voice in us. That's undeniable. But the real you, the inherent you, is not the id, but the yid, which is like the spark, the pintle. There's a spark of light that is the real driving, powerful force inside of a person. And he makes a whole case of how to access that. But you need to have the confidence that is there. Because if you don't have the confidence that you can do it, you're definitely not going to do it. If a person thinks, hey, I don't have the power, that's the first problem. The first thing a coach or a good friend has to do, is tell you have it in you, whatever you need, whatever it takes to get where you have to get. So in that context, using the Alter Rebbe is again another principle, is this principle of self-control. And then, as I said before, the principle that within us lies fires that are not been released yet, and that when you access that, it can transform your entire life. Now, even in healing, one of the principles of real healing is that you don't want to heal somebody. You want to be a catalyst to spark and to ignite their natural healing process. Because there is a natural healing process. But sometimes that gets overwhelmed by an infection, by a blockage, by so on, something not letting it emerge. Like if you have a cut, God forbid, even left its own, unless it's a serious cut, it will clot, coagulate, and will heal. There's a healing process. Almost everything has a healing process. The problem is if it's a deep cut and the bleeding keeps bleeding and bleeding, then what do you really need? You need some intervention, not to heal you, but to stop the blockages so the healing process can take over. Which is essentially what we can do, is to make sure that the healing begins. But healing always comes from within. Any medication is not meant to replace your immunity system. It's meant to supplement it. It's meant to energize it, meant to spark it, get it going, enhance it. Psychologically, it's exactly the same case. No one can help you solve your problems. What they can do is help ignite within you both the confidence, the awareness, and the inherent skills that you have to heal, to grow. Which begins with understanding that you have it, Salam Aleichem, at your disposal. It's in there waiting for you, waiting to be released. And you need someone to teach you the confidence, to teach you what it looks like, and teach you the confidence of how to access it. That's the challenge. And the impediment is ourselves, because we have our blocks, or because we convince ourselves we have a certain way of looking at things, that you're not ready to hear a different perspective. And that's the first thing that blocks you from going anywhere. Because if someone tells you, hey, listen, I have a solution for you, and you say, well, no, you don't get me, or you don't understand. You're basically bringing back your whole old history into the picture. You're never going to get a fresh piece of advice. So that's essentially like the bleeding continues, because you can't see that you're part of the problem, and you're not letting something else to ignite your own healing process. That I find to be the greatest challenge of all. How do you get somebody's attention to the point that they're ready to listen to a different approach? And it's far, far harder than you can imagine. Because we get convinced, we sometimes get addicted even to our own illnesses. Some people are comfortable with that. They get so comfortable with it that if you give them fresh air, they find that to be a problem. Because they're so used to breathing toxic air, a little fresh air makes them cough, and they say, no, that's not for me. You bring them into a healthy environment, they say, no, I don't belong here. Which of course sounds weird, but that's what happens. You get used to certain air, and you think your air is healthy, when really it's unhealthy, and when healthy air comes, fresh air comes in, you resist it. Now, I'm sure nobody here has been caught in that trap, but I've seen it around once in a while. I would say it's pretty prevalent. So, I plan to develop these, I plan to discuss the development of these ideas of the Alter Rebbe further in future weeks. Can't cover it all. So I will say, however, in context, because the most important thing is to go away with some action, some takeaway, as they say, something that you can implement. I've suggested this many, many times, and I suggest it again. Something we all can do, and this is also a key thing. If someone tells you, go change your whole life, usually not going to happen. It's just too much and too overwhelming, and it's not the approach. What you want to do is not tell somebody, okay, listen, you're breathing toxic air, or you have a distorted perspective, and here, look at the pure X-ray of your divine image, and let's get from here to here. It's too broad, it's too general, it's also too difficult, because you're already here, you've been here for years, you're not just going back to your divine image, even though it sounds so poetic. The key thing is baby steps, but consistent ones. That's the key. If you want to transition someone, let's say, who's been breathing for 20 years, toxified air, I'm not going to say 100% toxic, but let's say 80% toxic, 50% toxic. And then you suddenly give them a whole new room environment which is completely healthy air, it may not work. Too quick of a jump. What you do is, you try to minimize. You know what, well, let's get the 50% down to 40%. Now it's 60% healthy, fresh air. And then we move to 70%, etc. Psychologically is the same thing. Maybe even more important, because psychologically you can't even measure it in pure, tangible percentages. So it has to be done in a way where you can feel comfortable to make a move. So we're not talking about a leapfrog, a jump 50 steps. It's a one step at a time thing. I remember this class here years ago, we used to have like seltzer bottles on the table. Full seltzer bottles, that is. And at the beginning of the class, of course, people were thirsty. And as usual, what happens, someone's a little impatient, they open up the seltzer bottle, instead of the seltzer getting into their cup, it ends up drenching them from head to toe. So they have no seltzer, but the seltzer's all over them. You know that thing. It's happened. So I remember that happened, the seltzer ended up all over them, so I decided to use that as the theme of the class. It became how to open up a seltzer bottle. Or as they say, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. So Judaism and the art of opening a seltzer bottle. And the lesson was the following. The way you open up a seltzer bottle, especially if it has pressure, and you don't know how much pressure, so it's two twists, clockwise, and one twist back. Two twists opening it and one back. The problem is you make too many twists, so then you two twists, so that way it releases some of the gas, and then back and through. I said the lesson in life is we all have setbacks in life. So the approach is not to go ahead and just go like 50 steps ahead. What you should do is, for every time when you have a forward thrust, take double the setback, and you'll be ahead of the game. If you take one step forward and one step back, you're never going to open a seltzer bottle. So you have to have 2 steps forward, but 3 or 4 would already be too much. So the lesson in life is steps. And that's the key. A step that you can do that definitely moves you from here to somewhere else, but it's not an extreme jump. Extreme jumps never work. They never ever work. We're just not wired that way. Extreme jumps don't work. Extreme jumps work only when there's no choice, and you're forced to have an extreme jump when you didn't ask for it, which is usually not in a good, healthy situation. What you want to do is small steps, and Judaism is built on small steps. That's why there are many mitzvahs, and they're not dramatic ones. You give a penny every day to charity. You say a prayer every day. You study a little. These are not, they don't necessarily change your whole life. You still go to work, you still can do other things, you still have bad habits even. But what you do is introduce into your life some type of sustainable, kfiyas itim, which means consistent. It's not about cramming it all in one session, it's consistent drops. Like the story of Rabbi Akiva, when he was 40 years old, and he was a person who had never learned anything, and the woman he had met encouraged him to change his life and start studying. He said, 40 years old, it's too late for me. Going back to the story of, is there hope or not? And he was walking in the woods, Rabbi Akiva, and he saw a waterfall. He saw a stone with a perfectly bored hole right through the stone. And he said, how did a hole like that come here? Who drilled such a hole, perfect hole? And then he realized from the drops of water going through the stone that over the years, drop by drop by drop, pierced even an inanimate, hard stone. So he said to himself that if just the drops of water consistently can bear a hole through a stone, or bore a hole through a stone, which one is it? One of the two. Then how much more so with a human being, the psyche, the soul, consistently. Ein mayim ela Torah. Torah is like water. Consistently, drop by drop by drop, can pierce even the most callous, even a 40-year-old, which you could think is not such an old age. In those years, it was pretty old, but nevertheless, it's already shaped and you're defined. You're like a stone in many ways, hardened to pierce, and that's what he did. He went off to study, and he came back years later. Not only a scholar, he becomes Kula Da'aliba de Rabbi Akiva. The whole Torah, the whole Talmud, goes according to Rabbi Akiva. Became the greatest Talmud scholar ever. It's a lesson in life. It's interesting. Also, age 40, because many people that age, they think, like they're in between. You see here a man that was able to he changed all of history as a result, because he learned the lesson of consistent, step by step. It wasn't he saw some earthquake or hurricane or some overwhelming experience. It was little drops, little non-dramatic drops. Who would attribute anything to a drop of water? But just like there's the Chinese water torture, there's also in the Kedusha part, the positive thought, there's also that element. Drop by drop by drop can change lives, can change your life. So the practical suggestion would be is to take upon something that's very small but consistent, but that you have not done till now. You could choose anything you like. It can be a mitzvah, it can be studying, it can be praying. And one thing I suggest often is when you wake up in the morning, saying Moda'ani, which is a short one-line prayer, says, I acknowledge you for returning my soul to me. Great compassion. With great compassion. One-line prayer that takes literally seconds. But if you meditate on it and you think of it, this is my soul. My image, the divine image in which I was created, is given to you afresh and new every morning. Straight from it says, and then you say, Neshama shenasat to be the soul that you've given me. This soul I just mentioned is pure, and you've created it, you've shaped it, and you instilled it within me, and you protect it. These are the morning prayers that I just think about that personally, and you tell me if you don't do this every day, if you do this every day, you will definitely gain confidence because you'll start repeating the message. It's like a mantra. Again and again, my soul was returned to me. It's a pure soul. Nothing can blemish it. And then you'll start wondering, what am I doing with my soul? You do something like this every morning, guaranteed it'll be like the drops of water. It creates change. You say, what about the rest of my life? Is one big mess? You know what? You brought a little pure air. It's a fine 99% toxic. You have 5 minutes that weren't. It's also an achievement. Don't start thinking of, what do you mean 5 minutes compared to... That's not the way you think. The way to think is, because that's what your negative energy is going to tell you. What's 5 minutes when the rest of you is all messed up? It's not how it works. Healing doesn't begin that way. Healing begins on a small scale. You start untangling it there. You'll start seeing it has power. And we'll start spreading. And then before you go to sleep, instead of falling asleep with the television on, with a newspaper on your nose, or whatever, go to sleep with a meditation, spiritual thought, prayer, poetry, something that talks to your soul, not to your body, and something that is not about the business of your day, whatever it was. Something that takes you to a more sublime place. And guaranteed that too, another drop will have an effect besides on your sleep, but the rest of your life as well. There's a one evening prayer that we say, B'yot chaf kidruchi, Padisya Sikelem is also, I trust my spirit to you. Again, you're focusing on the divine image that you were created in. So these are some suggestions. You can definitely choose more, but I would choose over 100% consistency over volume. It's all about consistency. Day-to-day habits, those are the things that begin powerful forces. And they tend to start pushing out bad habits when you have good habits. Okay, so God bless everybody with this type of, hopefully, embracing in the 200th Yortzeit, an anniversary of the Yortzeit of the Alter Rebbe. It's about time we can begin to talk a little more about his models for life. As you'll see, they're deep, they resonate deeply. They're very, you can sense there's a truth to it because it's basically saying that each of us has a template that's far purer than you think it is. And then on that template, superimposed all kinds of other stuff. Like Michelangelo's line, I saw the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. So it's not about creating angels, it's about uncovering them. Uncovering the flowers, uncovering the music, uncovering the beauty. All these analogies work. And all this is captured so beautifully in the Alter Rebbe's teachings. So I think it's a tribute to him. We could be talking about this 200 years later. I'm totally committed to taking these ideas and helping develop it into true working models and working archetypes, which in turn will be turned into prototypes, which hopefully can then be replicated. And I don't mean this in the context of the Stepford Wives type of thing where everybody has to fit into some clone. On the contrary, it's about discovering your uniqueness, your individuality, your divine image, the way you've been shaped. The Talmud says that God, every human being looks different, thinks different, because each of us is a different variation of this divine image, everyone with their own particular mold. So may we all be blessed to discover it. Hopefully some of my words touched your divine image in its purest place, and more hopefully is that you actually can do something to bring it to the surface and illuminate your little corner of the world with your unique aura and glow and beauty. So thank you very much. And I want to just say that Philip, I think, is giving his class tomorrow night. I'm assuming he is. You can check with our office about that. I want to say Mazel Tov to Velvel. His son became engaged yesterday, so we should go to his little Chaim tonight. And I wish everybody only simchas and just good joyous occasions. Please stay in touch. If you have not left us your email address, please do so we can create a relationship. At least we can communicate with you with us. If you have any questions or any comments, you can feel free to access me, whether in writing or in person or in any possible way. And some people have suggested that I maybe open up the end of these classes to some questions, which I'm happy to do. So if anybody does have any questions, please, if you're shy, you don't have to ask them right here. You can ask them to me later in private, or, as I said, by email or other ways, or by phone, etc. Would you like to ask something?
When Rabbi Akiva saw this image of the dripping water that opened the world, but if somebody else saw it, they wouldn't do what he saw. It could Rabbi Akiva see it.
It's true, but now once he saw it, he taught us how to keep our eyes open for lessons like this.
What I mean is, he was ready to see it. Therefore, the image talked to him with that divinity. Somebody else wouldn't even notice that there was a hole. He was primed.
Yeah, well, you asked me a question when Rabbi Akiva saw it, but this is the story of life. Once a pioneer sees something and they share it with us, then it gives us ability to also access it. And that's how I see it. I mean, now you can learn this lesson. Everything in life is like that. It begins with someone teaching it to us, and then we say, hey, that's right. That's correct. But I would also say everybody of us, if you keep your eyes open, you'll find many lessons from things that we see. Absolutely, 100%. Thank you. So everyone have a pleasant week, and next week I may not be here, so maybe a recorded class. I may be traveling to Israel, so I'll let you know, but by email we'll make an announcement. Class will definitely be recorded and broadcast, but it may not be live on location. We will announce that, but keep your eyes open. Okay. Thank you again.